What's up, guys? Your agent Tyler Wehrung here, and today we're going to do a little book report on one of my favorite books of all time, Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. This book I read probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it really fundamentally changed the way I look at a lot of things: wealth building, life in general, and financial base foundation. So I want to jump into key lessons learned and outtakes from Rich Dad Poor Dad. Before I do that, I just want to highlight it's not about parenting at all. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a parenting book. It's really about Robert growing up. He had a dad. His actual dad was very successful in the government organization. He went to college. He has several MBAs and doctorate degrees, and really taught Robert a lot of the conventional wisdom that I think a lot of us, I'm sure you've heard before, go to school, get good grades, get a very secure job, things like that. And then he also had his best friend's father, very active in his life, but this dad had very conflicting views. He was a business owner, owned a lot of real estate. He was a very wealthy man. So he is the rich dad in the book, and then Robert's actual dad is the poor dad. All right, so just like to give that foundation so I don't lose any folks thinking I'm going to talk to you about fatherhood books. So with that, let's jump into the book. Alright guys, so lesson one with the book is that the rich do not work for money, but the poor and middle class do. Alright, so, and when he says the rich don't work for money, it's because they have their money work for them, and they don't actually have to go out and work for the money. So, he says that the poor and middle class work for money because we're primarily emotionally driven by two things: fear and greed. It's fear that we're not going to have enough to support our lifestyle, enough to pay the bills, enough to keep up with kind of the Joneses, the putting food in our mouth and our kids, taking care of that. Yet, on the other hand, when we get more, we get a raise or we get a bonus, we'll go out and buy things that just cause us to go back in the fear category. So, most people get a raise, they buy a new car. Or you get a bonus, you and your wife get a good job, it's decided to buy a bigger and better house. So then there's that greed factor, but then it go back to the fear of, well, can we really afford this? And so it's kind of this never-ending cycle that the poor and middle class get into. And he uses the example of the donkey with a cart chasing a carrot, where, the donkey's carrying the load, he's just going after the carrot, and wherever the farmer kind of angles the carrot, that's where the donkey goes. And that's what a lot of us do when we're working for these other employers and corporations. We're constantly chasing that money carrot. And he says, often when he talks to people about money, they say, well, I don't care about money, money's not important to me. And he says, well, you say that you're not interested in money or it's not important to you, yet you go to work for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to earn money. Yet you won't spend a little bit of time to understand what that money can do for you or why you're even doing it in the first place. So I guess the lesson there is kind of, don't kid yourself. Don't say you're not interested in money because you don't have the effort to learn more about it, but you're devoting so much of your life just to earn the money. So put a little time into dig into how to leverage it, how to make it work at best for you like the rich do. So that's kind of lesson one there, but really encourage you to dig in and take a deeper dive there. He then goes on to talk about financial literacy. So, to be, astute with your money, you really have to have a good foundation for understanding the basic concepts of money. I'm sure we've all can relate to a story about a lottery winner, an athlete, or a celebrity who comes into a mass amount of money, and then later we hear about them, filing for bankruptcy or sitting on the street, and most of us don't feel bad for them because, they live the high life. But, he talks about that a lot of that happens because they don't have a good foundation. And we see that a lot today. Most people get a good raise, or if you don't know what to do with it or you don't know how to handle a small amount, likely adding a lot more to it is just going to exacerbate that issue. And a lot of folks think that money is the answer, or if I just had enough money, I could, it would solve all my problems. But often we don't spend enough time to really understand the core foundations of what money can do for you. And so until you take the time to do that, likely you're not going to leave the current state of mind that you have with money. He says if you're going to go out and build another Empire State Building, you're not going to start from the dirt and just start driving posts in the ground. You're going to dig deep first to build a solid foundation to build that on, and money's no different. You have to do that. Unfortunately, it's not taught a lot in schools, so it's on you to go out and learn these things on your own. So great book to do that. He talks a lot about the very basics and has some very simple diagrams that can help you really understand that. So with that, I'm going to show you a simple diagram over here that will really help, I think will help lead into some of the things that he talks about. I'm kind of just going to vanilla it down one scotch. So over here you'll see two documents. One is an income statement and one is a balance sheet. So an income statement, or often called a profit and loss or a P&L, is used in your personal finance and businesses. So business uses more of the P&L version, but for your personal finances, it's an income and expense statement essentially. So the top is money coming in via salary or gross income, and after expenses you have net income or net profit in a business setting. So very simple concepts, and then those relate down to the balance sheet. And Robert talks a lot about the concept of how these things relate and how they cause money to flow in and out of your life. So if we look down at a balance sheet, and obviously very simplistic model here, but if you see the expense, the first expense here as a mortgage of $1,000, it relates down to the balance sheet as it shows up as an asset in the asset column for the present value of the home, and then also it shows the liability in the same row that's tied to that asset. So a $200,000 house, you might owe $150 on it, so that's $50,000 in equity, but then that relates back up to a mortgage payment that shows up on your income statement. So you can kind of see how that how the three are related. And then the same thing with a car, tied to the value of the car minus the car loan, and then it goes out on your income statement as an expense in the form of a car payment. So a very simple concept here, but I just want to highlight those before we go into a couple of the diagrams from the book. Yeah, with that, I'll kind of jump into one of the biggest eye-openers for me in the book was that Robert's rich dad taught him it's the number one and only rule to be rich. It's very simple. He says the only rule to be rich is to buy assets. Rich people buy assets and poor and middle class buy liabilities. So then the question becomes, what's an asset and what's a liability? He talks about as a kid, my dad's telling me this, of there's only one rule to be rich, and why isn't everyone doing it? And he goes into depth here and talks a lot about people's misunderstandings of what's really an asset and what's a liability. So I want to talk about those very quickly. So he breaks it down. He makes things very simple. An asset is anything that puts money into your pocket every month, and a liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. So if we relate that back to that income and balance sheet examples from before, you'll see the first is the example of a liability where an expense or a liability in that column will go out as an expense in the form of, for example, this is that car payment. Your liability is your car loan. It's going out of your pocket in the form of a car payment, and so in fact that makes the car a liability. Where on the other side, an asset, if we look over here at the cash flow pattern of an asset, it's maybe we'll use the example of a rental house. So the house would be in the asset column, and then it puts money into your account in the form of rent payments every month. So that's the cash flow pattern of an asset. So with that in mind, he shows some really good examples of the typical poor, middle class, and rich income statements and balance sheets. So let's look at some of those. So if we look at the first one here, this is the typical cash flow pattern of a poor person. They have money coming in from a job, it's coming in from their salary, and it's going out in the form of expenses, rent payment, food, transportation, etc. And you'll see nothing in the asset and liability column. All right, and next you'll see the income statement and balance sheet of the typical middle class. So you'll see that same job and salary coming in, yet now it goes out in the form of expenses that are tied to liabilities. So now this is the middle class. They've bought some liabilities. They got a house, a car loan, some student loans there that take those out in the form of payments associated to those liabilities. So no surprise there, but lastly, let's take a look at the income and balance sheet for the typical rich. So you'll see no job. They don't need a job because their money is working for them. You remember lesson number 1, the rich don't work for money. So you'll see assets are paying them in the form of income coming up to that top block in the income statement, and then they may have some liabilities associated to their assets, but the income is enough to cover those and still keep them profitable every month. So I thought these cash flow diagrams were a very helpful model to kind of think about like what makes the rich richer and why are most people in the poor and middle class area, and this kind of gives you an idea of the things that they do and the things that keep them there. So this was very impactful for me. And then he goes on to say, typically when you give someone in the poor and middle class money, we'll show over here, they get additional money in the form of raises or bonuses. Their income goes up, so do their expenses, and typically so do their liabilities. And conversely, if the same happens in the rich, you'll see when they get more money, they buy more assets. They typically pay liabilities down, and their expenses go down in proportion. So a very interesting thing there, but these cash flow patterns, if you kind of look at them in your own life, I think it would be very interesting to kind of how they relate back to, are you more relatable to the middle class, the rich, or the poor, and maybe you can pivot or shift to accordingly with where you want to be in life. So I did that, and that's kind of how I got into investing in rental property. So Robert goes on to talk about the typical family in America and how I think we can all relate. But it's a young couple. They start dating. They get an apartment together. They, at this point, really don't have any assets or liabilities. They're renting an apartment. They both graduate college. They land big boy jobs, big boy and girl jobs, and they deserve a new car. They've went through this 4 years of school, trudged it out. So they both go out and buy new cars and are proud of themselves. They buy 2 big liabilities associated with 2 car payments. They continue dating, decide to get married, likely fund the wedding via credit cards or other debt. Go on to have a kid. When they have the kid, they really decide they're pretty cramped in their apartment, decide to go out and buy a home. They have to buy a nice home because some of their friends have nice homes and they both have good jobs, right? Want to raise this kid in a good neighborhood, so they buy a much bigger home than they probably need. So they're adding to that liability column. I will say, Robert in the book, he catches a lot of flack. He calls your personal residence a liability because if you remember back to his first rule on liabilities, they take money out of your pocket every month. So that's a very controversial point in the book that a lot of people outside of the book argue about. But I highly recommend you check it out for yourself and form your own opinion. But if you go back to the rule on assets and liabilities, you have to side with Robert. But most bankers and typical financial and balance sheets will put your personal residence in the asset column. So just keep that in mind. But the point he wants to make with this young couple is they end up like most people in the middle class, they have a lot of debt, a lot of liabilities, and they're in what he calls and refers to a lot in the book as the rat race, where you're in this never-ending hamster wheel of, you have to go to work to have enough money to pay for your bills, and when you get those paid off or you get a raise, you buy more, which keeps you in the rat race, keeps you having to go to work, where the rich people figure out what they need to live on, buy enough assets to pay for those liabilities or expenses, which inevitably takes them out of the rat race. So very cool concept there that really changed my thought on my career and really what I'm hoping to do in life in general. So check this out. Let me know what you think about those concepts. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, I know this is going to sound boring, I'm going to talk about tax history and how it relates to you versus businesses and or corporations. I promise this won't be super boring. But he eventually goes on to say, you know, aside from religion, we left Britain, we as in the United States, left Britain to come to America to get away from these unruly taxes, things like that. And I'm sure we all remember the Boston Tea Party. This was kind of our tipping point or our opposition against taxes. And so after we kind of beat that out, a lot of people became to resell the idea of taxes as we're only going to tax the rich people. Kind of this Robin Hood effect of take from the rich, give to the poor. Sounds great in theory, but that's how they sold taxes back into the U.S. Or they sold it to the people to then vote it in to law. So I'm sure we all know now that that was probably not a great decision. But the point Robert makes in the book is that we often think that we can pass taxes or these unscrupulous things onto the rich, and you know it sounds good. But the rich have they have relationships, they have the money, the time, the resources to find ways around that. So just saying we're going to pass things on to them, it never works. He gives plenty of examples in here. They're going to find attorneys, they're going to find legal loopholes, they're going to find solutions to get around what you're doing. If they own a business, they're going to pass those new expenses back to the customer in the form of higher prices, and the customer typically being the poor and middle class. So just with that concept in mind, he also talks about back when they kind of first introduced this, that was the formation of corporations in the United States. These rich people hired attorneys to figure out ways to get around this, and the corporation was born. And how this helps the rich, I'm going to show an example over here. But so we're all familiar with how you know, we as employees pay taxes. You know, you earn the money, and then you pay your taxes before you even see the money. It's taken right out of your paycheck for the most part, and then we get to spend whatever's left. Well, the businesses or corporations, on the other hand, they earn their money, they pay expenses, and then they pay taxes on what's left. So it's a very different model. And you could see a lot of room for, there's a lot of gray area in the form of where you can pay expenses and kind of reduce your taxable income. So the point Robert makes here with context to paying taxes and all of this are there things that you're doing, or when you're venturing to build wealth, could you form a business and kind of run your life through a business, legally of course, to reduce your taxable income? These are things the rich people do, so are there things that you can be doing? For example, he talks a lot about real estate in the book. If you're building a real estate portfolio, could you do it as a company, have a company car, a company cell phone, a company internet, you know, company expenses that come out pre-tax. Remember, if you earn the money, then you pay everything, and you're only taxed on what's left at the end. Versus if you don't do it in a company, you are paying taxes out of that gross income, and then you're paying your car payment with after-tax things. So just an example there, but it kind of opens up your mind to a different way of thinking about kind of handling these different financial situations. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap. I know I went a little long here today, but guys, this is an excellent book, and I can't recommend it enough. So if you have different thoughts or takeaways once you read the book, I would appreciate any comments below. Any likes or subscribe on the video would be greatly appreciated as well. As always, very much appreciate your support. Tyler with Keller Williams. We'll catch you next time.